Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Independent Thought. My name is Desmond Price. Thank you for those of you who are listening to this podcast for your first time. This is your first listen. Welcome to the podcast. For those who are coming back as subscribers, much appreciated. Thank you for being subscribed to the podcast. So, today's episode, Red State, Blue State. Why am I calling it that? Why is it something worth talking about? We're going to be talking today about the Virginia election. I know it happened like 2 weeks ago. Why are we talking about something that happened 2 weeks ago? I know in this day and age, it feels like if you're not talking about it like the day after it happens, then you just can't have a conversation anymore. It's like, well, why are we talking about the Rittenhouse trial? We'll get to that. So we are talking about the Virginia election today. And I want to just point out that the things that we're going to be touching on are going to be what exactly happened, how the media reacted to it, my take on their reaction, and then why you should care. So obviously, let me just start out first and foremost by saying that, yes, while this episode, I meant for this episode to actually come out a week ago. And for those who are interested in why the podcast has gotten a little off track as far as the scheduling is concerned, I'll be touching on that at the end of the episode. So just stay tuned for my explanation why things have gotten a little shaken up here. But there was a few takes that were kind of thrown out there about this election and what happened and why it happened and so on and so forth. And I just could not quite overlook exactly what I heard and what I saw. And so I just felt like I had to give my opinion on this one. Even though it is a couple weeks in the past now. But let's normalize talking about news a couple weeks after it happens, everyone. Anyway, Glenn Youngkin, the Republican candidate for the governorship of the state of Virginia, did in fact win by beating Terry Mcauliffe. Now, Glenn Youngkin won by 2%. 50.6% to 48.6%. The media would have you believe that this was like some monumental win. But the truth be told is that Glenn Youngkin won by 63,000 votes in a state where 3.2 million were cast. Nevertheless, this is the first time that a Republican had won a statewide election since 2009. So this was giving a lot of cause for concern, especially with the fact that Glenn Youngkin was endorsed by President Trump and that he spent a lot of time talking about critical race theory. And a lot of people were trying to make a way of tying this race with everything going on nationally. That was like one of the big themes in the media. How can we look at what's happening in Virginia and equate that to what's happening everywhere in the country? And they had all kinds of reactions to this defeat of a Democrat in Virginia, where the Democrats have been undefeatable for the last decade or so, not only having the governorship, but also having two senators who are blue. I believe every member of the House in Virginia. No, I'm sorry, not the congressional House, but the state House, I think was run by Democrats. The state Senate was run by Democrats. The Democrats had complete control over the state. And to see a Republican win, it felt like a lot of people were very shocked by this, and they couldn't figure out why. So they had all kinds of reactions. Most of them were stoked in fear and lots of panic. They were saying that this was a victory for white supremacy. That was a really big talking point amongst CNN and MSNBC. They were saying that the Republicans won because of critical race theory and because of wokeness, because they were embracing the insurrection. Some people said that the reason why the Democrats lost in Virginia was because that Biden didn't pass an infrastructure bill quickly enough, and the voters in Virginia punished Democrats for that. Yeah, I don't think so either. Okay. In fact, one of my favorite parts about hearing all of the bad clips are the good people who actually take all of these clips and they smash them together into what's called a super cut. So I'm going to let you listen to that here in a second. There's going to be a lot of different people you're going to be hearing talking here for the next minute or so. But these are all clips that were put together from MSNBC and CNN. They are all reacting to why they believe that Glenn Youngkin won the governorship in the state of Virginia. Here's that clip.
Glenn Youngkin played the race card for a reason, because he knows it works on certain white voters.
He did stoke white grievance politics to mobilize the Republican base.
He's laundered Trump's really sort of disgusting, flagrant out racism. He's wrapped it in education.
Education,
right,
which is code for white parents don't like the idea of teaching about race.
That's the fundamental problem for these parents and this anti-CRT movement. They don't like the way whiteness is being portrayed in these new, more inclusive lessons.
This wasn't about those pocketbook issues. This was about how white kids feel talking about what black kids go through.
The subtext of all this was, we can't let these black and brown people run the country.
Glenn Youngkin running on critical race theory that he knew hit a chord around race.
I think all the CRT stuff is trumped up dog whistling.
Some of it was dog whistle racism.
The dog whistle messaging that you saw Youngkin engage in during the course of the campaign.
CRT is in the latest line of school busing, crosstown busing, welfare queens. You have it. It's in that same line, and you saw it in the results in Virginia.
This more palatable Republican who still uses the same racist themes that Trump did. He just packaged them in a soccer dad sweater vest model.
He's found a way to launder a pretty racist trope, this idea that we cannot talk about America's history because it hurts my feelings. He's turned that into a campaign.
White voters do have anxiety about a changing America, right? That it is blacker, it is browner.
You've got the Republicans yelling like, hey, look, the black and brown folks are coming for us.
Some Republican candidates are perfectly willing to use race as a motivating factor for their base. That has gone on for decades, and it happened this year.
Race is just the most palpable tool in the toolkit. It used to be of the Democratic Party back in the day when there were Dixiecrats, and now of the Republican Party.
This is about the fact that a good chunk of voters out there are okay with white supremacy. Let's call a thing a thing. Actually, scratch that. They are more than okay.
What the Democrats' theory of the case is that the white non-college educated voter cares about things like kitchen table issues, like infrastructure and pipes and how many gallons of milk you can put on the table. I contend that what they care about is using their guns on black people and getting away with it. That's what they want. That's what they actually are in it for.
So there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, you just heard a bunch of different people saying a bunch of different things. I do apologize if that was a little much, but my favorite bad take of everything that we just heard was the last person who spoke. A person by the name of Ellie Mistel. I hope I'm pronouncing their name right. A justice correspondent at The Nation. Oh my God, where do I even begin with takes like this? Let me try to just unpack this like one thing at a time. So the first thing that I want to dispel is that this election was somehow like tied like nationally to Joe Biden. Now CNN and ABC ended up doing exit polls of people who voted, you know, the day of. CNN in particular, their exit poll asked close to 4,000 voters, just a variety of different questions. I'm going to focus on a couple of different answers that were given. When voters were asked, did your decision today have any impact whatsoever because of Joe Biden? Like, did the president's job performance so far impact your decision to vote in this governor election? And half of them said no. But to be fair, the other half did say yes. So it was a 50-50 thing. And so you can kind of look at that one of two ways. You know, I guess you can say that what's happening in Washington, D.C. was having a direct effect on what was happening in the state of Virginia. Proximity, I'm sure, has a lot to do with that as well. But also half the people weren't. But when you actually dig a little bit further into the details here, the two main issues that came up, and this was number one, number two, not only through CNN's exit polls, but also on ABC's exit polls, the number one thing that people were voting on in that election, the economy. Duh. I mean, it's always the economy. Number two was education. Now, education was something that was focused on heavily by the mainstream media. They were trying to make this out to be that everyone was voting on critical race theory, either for or against it. And that was the reason why so many people were voting, you know, like either for the Democrats or against the Democrats. Let me just pump the brakes on education for a second. The economy being the number one issue should have been very telling right then and there. Like in that moment, it should have actually caused everyone kind of pump the brakes and stop and say the economy. You know, like what exactly is it about the economy that has everyone so worried? I mean, there's a lot of different things that you could probably extrapolate from saying that the economy is your number one issue. But when I was going through listening to people talk about this, it seemed as though people kind of just skipped right over that and decided to focus on education, the end, primarily critical race theory. It seemed as though the media wanted to make this whole governor's race only about critical race theory, and saying that if you voted for this Republican candidate, that you were a racist, or that you were believing in the dog whistling that was coming from talking points that are like closeted racist, or that you were promoting white supremacy in some way, shape, or form. And honestly, it feels incredibly lazy to me. But let's be fair. Let me just be fair to one thing in particular. I'm sure that some people in Virginia were in fact voting on this issue of critical race theory. As I've mentioned earlier in this season, critical race theory isn't actually being taught in schools. But what is being taught in schools is, I don't even know exactly how you would define it. Some people are calling it critical race theory adjacent, but basically it's an enhanced version of history. But in some school districts, there has been like diversity, you know, like equity and inclusion that's being incorporated into some of these schools. And I think how it's being incorporated has been uncomfortable for some people in certain parts of the country, and in particular in certain parts of Virginia. Now, during this race, Terry Mcauliffe, the Democratic governor candidate, was asked in an interview whether or not he thought that parents should have any kind of say in a school's curriculum. And he said no. Now, this ended up being something that his opponent, Glenn Youngkin, ended up using against him profusely. And, you know, attack ads were made on him about this. And also in this exit polling data, there was a question specifically targeted about this, saying, do you believe that parents should have a right to have a say in a school's curriculum? That was apparently a very hot button issue for a lot of people in the state of Virginia, whether or not parents should have a right to have any kind of control over the school's curriculum. And so one of the things I'm trying to point out here is that, yes, CRT played some elements, or just CRT adjacent, whatever, played some level of an element in people's decision making. I don't know that is exactly what people were really talking about when they said education. In fact, to CNN's credit here, they actually did some real investigating, went and talked to some real voters about why they made the decision that they made voting for Glenn Youngkin in this election. And they were asked what exactly it was particularly about education that they made that their number one issue. Here's the clip of these voters talking about that.
The school closures were really hard for a lot of kids, and one of my kids in particular really suffered when schools were closed.
It affected my family dynamic. It affected my social circles. It affected every part of me that the kids couldn't go to school. And so I had to figure out, what can I do to make sure that that never happens again?
And you feel like even right now, not enough is being done to address their learning loss. And you view that as a crisis.
We think
it's an emergency.
Our kids are in crisis. The learning loss is real. So we're in a situation where our kids are really far behind, and they need a lot of help. They need a lot of additional tutoring. They need a lot of additional time after school to help catch them up. And they're still not focusing on that.
How much did that factor into you, for you, the CRT debate and everything?
Definitely the education, the learning loss was number one for me. Everything else was below that.
Mandates and CRT did not influence my decision at all.
How about for you, Sandra?
No, mine was all about the school closures.
So I'll give them credit in this moment. CNN, did the work. They went and interviewed people, actually asked them, why is it that education was your number one issue? And so it's interesting to me that these women in this clip were unanimous in their feelings about the school closures and how that was why education was their number one priority, their number one topic, why they would shift to voting for Glenn Youngkin. That conversation as a whole seemed to be missing, however, in the larger coverage that we saw across CNN, MSNBC, as they were focusing on why this election turned out the way that it did. And honestly, that's part of what's very troubling about all of this, because it just felt as though when you saw how the media was portraying the story, it was as if they were trying to turn this into some national referendum on critical race theory. But this is a very local example of why voters might flip to a different party in this particular case, because of Virginia's just remote learning policy in certain parts of the state. It seemed as though it was a very big issue for a lot of parents for a variety of reasons. And so another thing to add on top of this is that it wasn't just one section of Virginia that actually drifted towards the Republican Party. When they did analysis on the state, found out that every single county in the state of Virginia actually went towards the Republicans. They moved away from the Democrats. Every single county, every one. And so this notion that it's just like, just like a few people who are somehow like racist, or they are, getting caught up in CRT, so on and so forth. I just don't know if that's quite a good enough explanation about what exactly happened in Virginia. And I know that some people, the day after the election or the day of, I saw this on Twitter. People were screaming about white women, saying, oh, look at what white women have done. And I can't believe that so many of them would vote Republican, so on and so forth. Okay. Let me just give you just the truth of the statistics here, because it's not quite exactly what it sounds like. Because when you look at the aggregate, it shows you that, yes, white women did move, percentage points, like from Democrat in 2020 to Republican in 2021. But here's the data I want you to focus on a little bit. I think it kind of tells a little bit of a broader story here. White women with a college education in 2020, they went 58% for Biden. In 2021, they went 62% for Mcauliffe. Now, white women who had no college education, in 2020, they went 56% for Trump. But in 2021, they went 75% for Youngkin. And I think, truthfully, that's where the actual discrepancy is that non-college educated white women, for whatever reason, actually went more towards Youngkin than they did even for Trump in this state. Now, I honestly am going to just level with you right here in this moment. I don't know exactly how to explain these statistics. I could probably give you a bunch of guesses. I could give you some educated answers as much as I can here. But to the original point that I wanted to make here, it's just kind of a lazy take to say that white women were the reason that Republicans, or that Glenn Youngkin in this particular case, got elected. It wasn't all white women. It was just a certain demographic of white women. But it wasn't just even just this demographic of white women. In fact, white men also shifted towards the Republican Party. Black women shifted towards the Republican Party. Youngkin won a majority of the Latino voters in the state of Virginia. Now, the mainstream media, again, as you heard in that clip that I played earlier, they just wanted to make this about like, oh, well, people got caught up in dog whistling. They got caught up in racism. They got caught up in wanting to enfranchise people who wanted to be racist towards Black people. That is just a really just lazy take. I'm sorry. It's a very lazy take. It's not indicative of what we're actually seeing here. And I'm sure that Black women who decided to vote Republican, I think the demographic went from 8% who voted for Republicans in 2020 to 14% in 2021. And again, the majority of Latino voters, I'm sure that those people aren't white supremacists, but somehow they got labeled as such for voting Republican in this particular election. It's not a good look. It really isn't. And the reason why I'm harping on this, the reason why this is so important to me, why I've been drilling this again and again and again, why I'm making the story about the mainstream media, they have an incredible amount of power and influence over the average everyday person. They have millions of people who hear them directly every single day, and then millions more who hear what they have to say indirectly through everyone who covers what they say, whether that's print journalism, independent media, when people make memes and throw them around the internet. They have an incredible amount of resources to actually thoroughly look at these stories and try to figure out exactly what's happening in these particular races. But instead of doing that, they took the path of least resistance, tried to turn what happened in Virginia into a single issue narrative and then run with that narrative again and again and again and again, probably because it was generating a lot of clicks and a lot of watch time for them online and on TV. And I just got to tell you, if the goal, is because, I think for most people, if you're watching CNN and MSNBC, you probably know at this point in time that these two stations are basically just extensions of the Democratic Party. They represent the Democrats the way Fox represents the Republicans. They all claim that that's not the case, but I think we all know otherwise, right? And so if CNN and MSNBC are supposed to be these extensions of the Democratic Party, do you really believe that you're, going to shame people into continuing to vote for Democrats by telling people who voted for Biden in 2020, but then voted for Youngkin in 2021, that they're now all of a sudden terrible people and racist when somehow they weren't a year ago? Is that the take we want to give? I just feel like it's incredibly lazy. And honestly, on top of being lazy, it's also misleading, because the one thing that I saw again and again was just this absolute shock that a blue state like Virginia could elect a Republican for governor. Or also what happened on the same night was that New Jersey almost elected a Republican for governor. And New Jersey actually is even more of a blue state than Virginia is. And so there was like, what is going on? I can't believe a Republican might almost win New Jersey. How exactly did that happen? But what also made me even more sad was the fact that some of my independent news sources who I routinely get media from, even they were having these takes. Like, oh, what does this mean if New Jersey almost goes red or Virginia goes red? Like, what does this mean nationally? Is this indicative of what's going to happen in 2022 or 2024? Look, I feel like this is the point where people just need to just take a deep breath and actually just maybe do a Google search or two, because it really isn't that hard to figure out exactly how just a little overreactionary this actually is. Let me give you a few examples of what I mean. So for instance, currently, Kansas, a red state, as red as you can possibly be, it went plus 20 for Republicans in 2016 and plus 15 in 2020 for Republicans. The state of Kansas currently has a Democrat for their governor. Laura Kelly is her name. In Kentucky, again, a state that went plus 30 for Republicans in 2016, plus 26 for Republicans in 2020. They have a Democratic governor. His name is Andy Beshear. Also, the state of Louisiana. I do have to tell you that it's a red state. It went plus 20 for Republicans in 2016, went plus 19 for Republicans in 2020. They have a Democrat for a governor. John Bell Edwards is his name. And he's been elected not once, but twice in 2015 and 2019. He is their current governor, a Democrat in the South. But it's not just in red states, it's also in blue states. Currently, Larry Hogan is the Republican governor of the state of Maryland. Now, Maryland's not just a blue state, it's a super blue state. In 2016, Maryland went plus 27 for the Democrats and plus 33 for the Democrats in 2020. Now, Larry Hogan, again, a Republican, is considered to be one of the most popular governors in the country, a Republican in a blue state. He's been elected not once, but twice. He is their two-term sitting governor of Maryland. Charlie Baker is the Republican governor of Massachusetts. Again, he is elected not once, but twice. He is serving currently his second term. Massachusetts is another super blue state where they have basically identical stats to Maryland. In 2016, went plus 28 for Democrats, 2020 plus 33. And just like Hogan, Charlie Baker is considered one of the most popular governors in America. In fact, in 2018, in his second election, he won 67% of the vote. Now, imagine for a second that had happened in Virginia, right? The media would have lost their mind. They would have lost their mind. They're like, oh, what does this mean for the country if a Republican can win 67% of the votes in a blue state? Like, is hell freezing over? But, that happened in Massachusetts just 3 years ago. I mean, this is what I'm trying to say. This really isn't abnormal. I mean, this actually goes on. Chris Sununu is the current Republican governor of New Hampshire. New Hampshire is one of two states in the country where their governors only serve 2-year terms. So Sununu has been elected 3 times now, 2016, 2018, 2020. And right next door, Phil Scott, again, another Republican, is the governor of Vermont. So in the same state that Bernie Sanders is a senator, they have a Republican governor. Now, this person actually just won again in 2020. So in the same year that Vermont as a state went plus 36 for Joe Biden, they also elected a Republican governor. So this really isn't weird, everyone. It really isn't. It's not even weird for New Jersey. People have short-term memory when it comes to this. But if you know who Chris Christie is, he was the 2-term governor for the state of New Jersey, a state which was just as blue when he was the governor, another Republican, as it is currently today. Chris Christie won comfortably in 2013, getting 60% of the vote, 1 year after it sent Barack Obama into a second term. And honestly, I'm going to just end this piece of all this little trivia here with my state of Montana, where Montana has been a red state forever. But in 2004, the same year that this state voted for George W. Bush, they elected a Democratic governor. And then in 2008, they voted for John McCain, but elected a Democratic governor. And then in 2012, they elected Mitt Romney, but elected a Democratic governor. And then again in 2016, elected a Democratic governor the same year they elected Donald Trump. This really isn't a weird phenomenon. This happens across the country. And it is incredibly, again, this is probably the last time I'm going to say this is incredibly lazy and just misguided of our mainstream media to kind of misdirect us into thinking that this is something that doesn't happen really, or that this is somehow, it means that, the political landscape is shifting, or that the dynamics that are happening there, everyone should be worried about. The media, we're seeing during this time of the pandemic right now that the media has, in a lot of ways, come under fire for people not really trusting what's going on with the pandemic, with vaccines, so on and so forth. People are citing the media as one of the reasons why they don't trust what's going on with the pandemic, because they just don't believe in the media. The polling for the media is at an all-time low. People are at an all-time low for their trust in our institutions, primarily our media and how we receive our information. Stories like this don't really help. They really don't, because it wouldn't have taken that much effort for these large companies who have hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars at their disposal to just do a little bit of extra work and give the full story about what exactly happened in that state. Because the truth be told is that what happened in that state really isn't that strange. It isn't that bizarre. And it probably wasn't worth all the coverage it got. It probably wasn't worth me doing this episode on it, truthfully speaking. But I just wanted to kind of bring my take to you about all of this, because the big takeaway that I want you all to know is that I understand that most people do, in fact, absorb the news in a very casual way. They trust the people that they receive their news from to be genuine and to be giving them the truth and the whole truth. And there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. I feel that weight every time that I come on here and talk to you about anything. I spend a lot of time trying to research any topic that I make an episode on, because I want to make sure that I'm being as thorough as I humanly can. And it genuinely upsets me that I feel as though so many people in our country are kind of being fed narratives that are based on half truths, or being based on just lazy takes. And now there's so many people in this country who think that, what happened in Virginia is actually just nothing more than just a bunch of people embracing white supremacy, when really the truth is so much more complicated than that. And honestly, on top of all that, that race was probably nothing that anyone outside of the state of Virginia ever needed to really hear about. But here we are. And so that's our episode for this week. We're going to take a quick break, everyone. And when we come back, I'm going to have my guest for this week. So make sure you stay tuned. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us for this episode of Independent Thought. First and foremost, I'm going to thank my guest for this week, Courtney V. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and gracing us with your presence. Hoping to have you back on again in the future. For those of you who are interested in hearing more about Courtney V, don't forget to check out her podcast, The Barbie Way. It'll be linked in the episode description down below. And I'm hoping to have her on one of my panels in the upcoming future. So hopefully you'll get to see more of her then. Speaking of which, if you have not already, stop what you're doing and go subscribe to the YouTube channel, people. YouTube is going to be a very critical part of independent thought going forward. We will be having content on there that is separate from what's going to be on here. There'll be stuff on there that just won't be on here. So you got to be subscribed to both. It is a both kind of world now. But speaking of the podcast, what you can expect coming next is I'm going to try to get a bunch of episodes put out in the next couple weeks here, because I am behind a schedule. So usually you would get 1 or 2 episodes a week tops. That might be changing very soon here, so I can get kind of back on track here, because the podcast has been a little delayed As I'm sure some of you have noticed, I was supposed to put out an episode last week. That did not happen. The episode from the prior week came out on a Thursday. It should have came out on a Monday. Everything is a little backed up right now. So truth be told, as I said at the beginning of the episode, I'd give you my reason for the delay now. Your host has been having a variety of health problems, and they have been keeping me mostly out of commission. I think it's probably the best way I can describe it. I've been mostly out of commission for the last few weeks here. It's been causing all kinds of issues for me. Not going to get into a bunch of different details right now, but medical stuff's kind of come up, and it just felt like the best course of action was to kind of put the podcast down for a little while and just focus on recovering. So that's what I did. And, I've been having some ups and downs. I actually had to go in for a surgery. But, hoping that things will continuously get better from here on out. But, the truth be told is I'm not sure if there'll be more delays with the podcast or not, but my hope is that there won't be. Hopefully there'll be smooth sailing from now until the end of the season. But I'll keep you all updated on that. But hopefully, it'll be smooth sailing. My season, if it ends on time, should be ending in about a month. I have, I think, 6 or 7 more episodes planned before the season ends. I'm looking to end the season in the middle of December, about a month from today, actually. So I should be getting quite a few more episodes before then. But then, just like around this time last year, I'll be taking my season break, and I'll be gone for about 6 to 8 weeks through the middle of December through the end of January. We'll be returning first week of February. We'll be returning with season 5, and I have a brand new format for the podcast I'm going to be implementing, as well as a bunch of new guests and topics. So lots of things to look forward to, but I'll be touching more on that as we kind of get closer to the end of this season. But for now, I just want to say thanks to everyone who is sticking with me through this long year and for dealing with these delays as they've been going on. And finally, I want to thank my patrons, because I've gotten quite a few new patrons in the last month and a half here. So huge thank you to everyone who is supporting the podcast on Patreon. It is monumental, truthfully speaking. All the things that I want to do with independent thought are becoming more and more possible as I am able to kind of generate more and more support. So thank you all for believing in the podcast enough to donate to it financially. That's massive, and I'm incredibly humbled by it. So special thank you to all the current patrons and the former ones. I absolutely bear no ill will towards people who signed up but had to leave. Times are tough for everyone right now, so I totally get that. So last but not least, I just want to say thanks to everyone who keeps up with me on social media as well. If you are not currently, please follow me on Instagram or Twitter at Independent Thought. Best place to keep up with me and the podcast. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this episode. I will see you in the next one. Take care.